Welcome to the deep dive.
All right, so you've sent over some information about this incident with the TJ Actions changed files GitHub action.
Yeah,
Um, and it's pretty serious stuff that we really need to dig into.
absolutely. I think, this whole thing, it's a pretty stark reminder about, just how many potential vulnerabilities are lurking in our, software supply chains,
Yeah,
even in these like seemingly, really small and kind of basic utilities.
right.
So,
For everyone listening out there, what we're going to try to do today in this deep dive is to really understand what exactly happened with this action.
right.
Who was potentially affected by this,
Uh-huh.
and maybe even more importantly, what are the key takeaways that you need to be thinking about for your own, security awareness and practices.
Absolutely. And, I think it's worth pointing out right from the start that this, the TJ Actions changed files is something that's used incredibly widely. This action basically, it lists the files that have been modified in a commit or in a pull request.
Right.
And it's integrated into over 23,000 repositories.
Wow.
So you can imagine that when something like this gets compromised,
Yeah.
the ripple effect is potentially massive.
Yeah. I mean,
Okay.
think about it. So many of your automated workflows, they rely on knowing what files have changed
Yeah.
to trigger specific tests or deployments. It's
Mhm.
like a really fundamental building block for so many, CICD pipelines. So,
It's-
we're not going to try to bog everyone down with all the tiny little technical details.
Yeah.
But we really want to make sure we extract the essential insights from all this material.
Uh-huh.
Make sure you're well informed and, ready to take any necessary steps.
Right.
Okay, so let's start by looking at the timeline of the attack.
Okay.
It sounds like things moved really quickly once it was detected.
Yeah, they did the first sign of, that there was a problem.
Yeah.
Came on March 14th, 2025, when Step Security Harden Runner, which is a tool that monitors the runtime behavior of, workflows and actions and stuff.
Right.
They detected an anomaly. And specifically what they saw was that, there was a workflow
Okay.
that was using, TJ Actions changed files.
Mm-hmm.
And it was trying to communicate with an external website that it shouldn't have been talking to.
Okay.
It's like a security camera spotting somebody going into a room that they have no business being in.
So an action that's supposed to be just focused on, files locally and changing files.
Yeah,
It's now suddenly reaching out to the internet.
exactly.
Yeah, that's definitely a red flag.
It is, and that pretty quickly after that initial detection led to something that was even more concerning,
Mm-hmm.
and that was that most of the version tags that were associated with TJ Actions changed files have been retroactively updated around March 14th and 15th.
What? Retroactively.
Yeah, this fundamental assumption that you might have had that, you get an old version tag.
Right.
That's a safe anchor point.
Right.
That got completely thrown out the window in this attack.
Wow.
And this is, it's a really critical thing to understand.
Yeah.
Because it means that even if you had specified what you thought was a safe old version of the action,
Right.
you could still end up running, unknowingly the compromised code.
So what, you're saying retroactively updated?
Yeah.
How is that even possible? That goes against everything we think about tags.
Right.
They're immutable once they're set, they're supposed to be.
That's the idea.
Right.
Right. And Git tags are supposed to be, these stable pointers to a point in your project history.
Yeah.
But the problem is that somebody who has, write access to the repository
Okay.
can move those tags around or they can recreate them.
Right.
So yeah, that's exactly what happened here.
Wow. Okay. So
Then just a day later, on March 15th, we started to see the really alarming evidence coming out, which was that secrets were starting to show up in the build logs of public repositories.
wow.
The attacker didn't even have to set up their own, infrastructure to exfiltrate the data.
Right.
They just basically weaponized the existing logs.
That's crazy.
So think about that,
yeah.
your own security visibility became the point of vulnerability.
Yeah. So public logs, I mean, anyone who has access to those repositories
Right.
could potentially see those secrets.
Yeah, that's right. And that's a huge, exposure risk.
Yeah, that's a huge risk.
So GitHub responded very quickly.
Yeah.
Once they were alerted.
Okay.
And they removed the action from their marketplace
Okay.
on March 15th
Right.
to prevent any further use of it.
Yeah.
And then later on that same day, they were able to actually restore the repository to a clean state.
Okay.
So basically rolled back the malicious code and rolled back all the tag manipulation that had happened.
Got it.
Um, but, it's important to note that all versions from V1 all the way to V45 were considered compromised during that, brief but very critical period.
So basically from that initial detection
Yeah.
to GitHub intervening, it was a really, really rapid series of events.
Yeah, it was very fast moving.
Yeah. So, okay, let's talk about like the mechanics here.
Okay.
How did the attackers actually get in and how did they actually like pull this off step by step?
So the initial point of entry seems to have been the compromise of a personal access token,
Okay.
or PT for short,
Right.
which is basically like a digital key that gives, automated systems permission to make changes.
Right.
And this PT belonged to an account called @TJ Actions bot,
Okay.
which was apparently being used to manage this action.
Mm-hmm.
And what's really interesting is that GitHub has said that they weren't able to definitively determine how this PT was compromised.
Oh, wow.
So even GitHub
yeah.
couldn't figure out how these credentials were stolen.
Wow.
What does that tell us about the potential vulnerabilities in these automated systems?
Yeah, I mean, that's a question that lingers,
Oh, right.
If even the platform provider isn't sure how the credentials were stolen,
Right. Yeah.
it makes it that much harder to put in place, preventative measures going forward.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And it really underscores the need for, really robust security practices around these automated accounts,
Right.
and their access tokens.
Right.
So anyway, once they had access, the attacker introduced, a malicious commit,
Mm-hmm.
a piece of malicious code.
Right.
And interestingly, they disguised the commit details to make it look like it came from the Renovate bot,
Okay.
which is, a pretty widely used automated tool that helps keep your project dependencies up to date.
Right.
So, this could have very easily helped the malicious change blend in with legitimate updates.
Right. So they're basically just trying to slip this in by making it look like routine maintenance.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Now, crucially, this malicious commit was what's called an orphaned commit. And think of an orphaned commit like it's a secret side branch in your project history that isn't connected to the main road.
Mm-hmm.
It's easier to sneak something in that way without it going through the usual checkpoints.
All right.
And it was also unsigned.
Okay.
So for people who, verify commit signatures, that should have been an immediate red flag.
Yeah.
Okay, so they're trying to, slip this in, making it look like routine maintenance, hiding it from, the normal flow of things.
Yeah. Devious.
Devious. But the really impactful part of the attack was the retagging of existing versions.
Okay.
So they didn't just, introduce a new malicious version.
Right.
They actually went back and changed the existing tags versions like V1.0.0 all the way up to V44.5.1
Wow.
to point to the same malicious commit.
So that's where that misconception about Git tag immutability really comes into play.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
even if you had pinned your workflow to what you thought was a safe version tag, from months ago,
Right.
you could have unknowingly been running this compromised code.
That's exactly right.
Wow. Okay.
So once these tags were pointing to the malicious commit, anybody using those versions,
Mhm.
in their workflows would download and run the compromised action.
Right.
And this modified action then did something else that was really important.
Okay.
It fetched an additional malicious Python script from a GitHub gist.
Okay.
And this gist was located at https.gist.getfewpthiscontent.com/Ikeda 30525B776C409 099098023AT54965 rommdump.pi.
Wow. That's a long URL.
It is. And to make things, less obvious, this script is obfuscated using base64 encoding.
Right.
It's like they're like putting your code in a very, very simple secret code that's easy to undo, but it makes it less obvious at first glance.
Yeah. So basically that initial malicious commit was essentially just a delivery mechanism to go and get that real, harmful code from this external gist.
Yeah, exactly right.
Okay.
And what this Python script did was it was designed to dump the memory
Okay.
from the GitHub Actions runner,
Right.
which is the environment, where all your automated tasks are executed.
Mm-hmm.
And it's specifically targeting a process called worker.
Okay.
And then it used regular expressions, which are basically, search patterns, to look through this memory dump for
Yeah.
anything that looked like it might be a secret.
Huh.
API keys, tokens, credentials, that sort of thing.
Right.
And any secrets that it found were then base64 encoded again and put it directly to the workflow logs.
Okay. So instead of sending these secrets to a server that they control. They're just basically like leaving them out in the open in the logs for anyone to see.
Right.
I mean, that seems surprisingly straightforward.
It does seem that way, doesn't it?
Yeah, like, is there a reason why they might have chosen that method?
So on the surface, yeah, it seems less sophisticated.
Right.
You
Yeah.
know, but the thing is, a lot of open source projects have their workflow logs publicly accessible.
Oh, I see.
So by just, printing these secrets out to the logs,
Right.
the attackers could then just come along at their leisure and collect all this stuff
Oh, I see.
without having to set up, and maintain their own external infrastructure to receive the data.
Right.
So this approach, it also might suggest that they were focused on specific public projects
Okay.
where, really valuable secrets might be found.
Got it.
And, we even have an example of what a leaked secret might look like
Okay.
in the logs, just, random looking string of characters.
Right. And because it was base 64 encoded,
Yeah,
it wouldn't necessarily like jump out to somebody who's just like, skimming the logs.
that's right.
Yeah. Okay. So beyond that,
Yeah.
There's this potential for exploitation through auto-merging workflows.
Right.
So if a repository has like automated the merging of pull requests from bots like Renovate, and if Renovate, suggested an update to this action,
Right.
that malicious version could have been merged and executed automatically without any human review.
Yeah. That's scary.
Yeah.
It's a silent automated compromise.
It is, yeah.
So to address the attack, GitHub took a bunch of steps.
Okay.
They immediately revoked the compromised PT.
Right.
They updated the password for the @TJ Actions bot account.
Okay.
They enhanced its authentication by using a passkey.
Huh.
And they made sure that, the account was operating with the absolute minimum necessary permissions.
Got it.
So, they reacted very quickly to contain the damage.
Right. So they reacted quickly to contain the damage.
Yeah.
But this whole thing, brings up some really fundamental questions about the security of the components that we rely on in our workflows.
Yeah.
And that kind of brings us to the broader, supply chain security risks.
Yeah, absolutely. This whole incident really highlights the fact that, a compromised component in your CI process is essentially the same as having a compromised pipeline.
Right.
An action that's running in your CI environment.
Yeah.
Has a lot of access.
Yeah.
It can read your secrets, it can modify your project's files.
Yeah.
And as we saw, it can even inspect the memory of the container that it's running in.
Right. It's like, you're inviting a seemingly helpful guest into your home,
Yeah.
only to find out that they have keys to everything.
That's a good analogy.
Yeah, and the fact that secrets were exposed in public repositories, it really underscores a continuing vulnerability.
Yeah.
And even in private repositories, if your logs aren't secure, sensitive information can leak out.
Yeah, absolutely.
And the fact that these version tags were retroactively tampered with, I mean, that's another critical lesson here.
Yeah.
It really erodes the trust that we place in versioning.
It does.
Especially for something that's, used so widely.
Right.
Like if historical versions can be silently altered,
Uh-huh.
how can we be sure about the code that we're using?
Right. It really forces us to rethink some of these fundamental beliefs.
It does. It makes you question every single link in that development chain.
It does.
And the fact that, so many people were potentially impacted by this because this action is used so widely.
Yeah.
I mean, it really highlights how interconnected all of our software ecosystems are.
Absolutely.
And how a single point of failure can have these huge consequences.
That's right. And, a widely used action like this becomes a prime target.
Right.
Because a single compromise can give them access to so many different projects.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So.
Okay, so given all that, what are the real world consequences for someone who might have been using this action?
Yeah.
And what are the immediate steps that they need to take?
Okay, so the number one priority for anybody who was using this action during that affected time frame is incident response.
Okay.
If you have public repositories that were using this action, you need to rotate any secrets immediately.
Okay.
API keys, tokens, credentials, anything that was in your CI environment around March 14th and 15th till 2025.
Okay, even if they have only private repositories, should they be worried?
In this particular case, the attacker exploited public logs.
Right.
But it's still a good idea to consider rotating secrets.
Okay.
Used in private repositories as well.
Okay.
Especially if you're not totally sure about the security of your log storage.
Okay, so incident response is number one.
Yep.
Um, beyond that, the fact that the action was removed from the marketplace,
Yeah.
obviously that caused disruptions
So,
to workflows for people who rely on it.
absolutely.
And, as we talked about before, this incident has probably shaken the trust that we place in GitHub Actions in general.
It has.
So, it forces us to really reevaluate our dependencies and security practices.
It does.
Okay, so how can somebody determine if they were impacted?
Yeah.
Like, what are some practical steps?
Okay, so there are some tools that have been made available.
Yeah.
There are Python scripts,
Mm-hmm.
TJ Action Search Phoenix-v2.py,
Yeah.
and TJ Action Search Phoenix-v2 with upload.py that you can use to scan your repositories.
Got it.
You'll need to clone the associated test repository to actually run those.
Okay.
But, really the most critical place to look for signs of compromise is in your GitHub Actions logs.
Okay.
You go into your repository on GitHub, go to the Actions tab,
Right.
and then you want to look really carefully at the logs for any workflow runs that happen around March 14th and 15th, 2025.
Yeah, and we have a visual aid here that we
Yeah.
can show you just to highlight exactly where that tab is.
All right.
So users, you should really be focusing on those specific dates
Yeah,
and times in your history.
absolutely.
Okay.
Additionally, you should just do a search, across your organization's code base.
Yeah.
For any instances of TJ Actions changed files within your workflow definition files,
Okay.
the command git grep-r TJ Actions change -files can be really useful for that.
Okay.
And beyond just identifying where the action was used,
Yeah.
you really want to carefully examine those runner logs
Okay.
for any indication that secrets might have leaked
Right.
or any references to secrets within your GitHub Actions configuration files around the time of the attack.
Got it. Okay, so what if they do find potential secrets in their logs?
Yeah, so if you find any sensitive information exposed in your logs,
Uh-huh.
or if you even suspect that that's a possibility,
Right.
you need to rotate those keys immediately.
Wow.
And even if you don't find, explicit evidence of leakage,
Mm-hmm.
the decision of whether to rotate keys or not really comes down to your own risk assessment
Okay.
and the potential damage that could result if you were compromised.
Right.
Think about who has access to your logs.
Yeah.
Even what you consider private logs might have broader access than you realize.
Right. That sounds like a lot of work
It can be.
for, a lot of organizations out there.
Yeah. Okay,
So moving forward,
yeah.
one really key recommendation to bolster your security is to think about pinning
Your GitHub Actions to specific immutable commit SHAs
Okay.
rather than relying on version tags.
Right.
Because version tags, we've learned that they can be changed.
Right.
And that way you can be absolutely certain that you're always executing the exact code that you intend to,
Right.
regardless of whether a tag is, subsequently moved or altered.
So can you give an example?
Yeah. So for example, instead of, writing something like uses action checkout at v4,
Okay.
you would specify, the full commit hash.
Right.
Something like uses.action checkout at A1B2C3D4E5F6.
Okay. So you're basically using that unique identifier.
That's right.
Okay.
Now, it's important to acknowledge that there are some trade-offs with this approach.
Okay.
It requires more manual verification and updating,
Okay.
and it can make your workflow files a little bit less human readable.
Right.
But you get a much higher degree of security.
Okay. So it's kind of like more security, but a little bit more overhead.
Exactly. Another really vital thing to consider is implementing runtime security monitoring
Okay.
for your CICD runners.
Okay.
There are tools out there from vendors like Step Security, Cycode, Upwind, Suite, and Armo.
Okay.
And they could provide real-time anomaly detection
Okay.
and help prevent, bad stuff from happening in
Right.
your CICD environment.
Yeah, and we saw how Step Security's tool was really instrumental in detecting that weird connection to the GitHub gist.
It was.
So that early detection was really crucial in uncovering the attack.
It was critical.
Yeah.
And finally, GitHub has an allow listing feature for actions.
Okay.
And this can provide, a very valuable preventative security layer.
Okay.
It lets organizations specify exactly which actions are permitted to run in their environment.
Right.
And then it blocks everything else.
Got it.
So it's like having, a pre-approved list of tools
Right.
that can be used in your development process.
Okay, so we've talked about what happened. We've talked about what steps people can take if they think they might have been affected.
Right.
So let's shift gears now and talk about proactive defense.
Okay.
What are the best practices that people can put in place to prevent these kinds of attacks from happening?
Okay. So as we've talked about, the most important thing is to pin your GitHub Actions to specific, immutable commit SHAs.
Right.
That gives you the highest level of assurance that you're running the code that you intend to run.
Okay.
And, whenever possible.
Yeah.
You should also try to verify the integrity and signatures of the actions that you're using.
Right.
Look for actions that offer signed releases.
Okay.
Or provide cryptographic checksums.
Got it.
Using GitHub Actions allow listing at the organizational level.
Okay.
That's another extremely effective preventative measure.
Okay.
By explicitly defining which actions are allowed.
Right.
You dramatically reduce your attack surface.
We are basically minimizing the points of entry.
Exactly.
Got it.
It's also really important to follow the principle of least privilege.
Okay.
For your workflow permissions.
Right.
So only give your GitHub Actions the bare minimum permissions that they need.
Right. Don't give them, access to everything.
Exactly. Avoid giving, broad, unnecessary permissions that could be abused.
Okay.
Continuous monitoring and sandboxing of runner behavior.
Mm-hmm.
Using runtime security tools like Step Security Harden Runner.
Yeah.
That provides another really important layer of defense.
Right. And we saw how, effective that can be.
We did.
Okay.
Regular and thorough dependency audits for all the components in your pipeline,
mm-hmm.
Including GitHub Actions, are essential.
Right.
Stay informed about, CVEs that might affect the tools that you rely on.
Okay.
And then finally, practicing incident response drills,
mm-hmm.
specifically for, CICD compromises can be really helpful.
That's a great point. You have to be prepared for a potential compromise, just like you would be prepared for a compromise in your production environment.
That's right.
Okay, so now to give our listeners a little bit of context.
Okay.
Can you talk about some other supply chain attacks that have happened so that, we can learn from the wider landscape of threats?
Yeah, absolutely. So, unfortunately, this type of attack is becoming more and more common.
Right.
There are a lot of examples. We've got the CodeCoff Bash uploader compromise in 2021.
Right.
Where the attackers were able to get access to a script that was used in a very common CI tool.
Right.
And they were able to steal environment variables, which included sensitive secrets.
Oh, wow.
And that impacted a huge number of users.
Yeah.
We've got the SolarWinds Orion build attack in 2020,
mm-hmm.
which was a really sophisticated attack.
Right.
Where the attackers were able to compromise the build pipeline and distribute malware, across a vast network of organizations.
Yeah.
The Travis CI secrets leak in 2021
highlighted
how vulnerabilities in CI platforms themselves can expose sensitive information.
Yeah.
And then, of course, we've got all these compromises of open source packages, in repositories like NPM and PyPI, where malicious code is injected into popular libraries.
Right. So it's not just GitHub Actions we're talking about. It's all of these different.
It's the whole software supply chain.
It's everywhere. Okay. So it's a persistent and evolving threat environment.
It is.
That we all need to be aware of.
Yeah.
So to wrap things up, what are the key detection and remediation strategies?
Okay. So first, you need to figure out if you're using or if you've used this compromised action in the past.
Okay.
You can use tools like GitGrep.
Mm-hmm.
Or GitHub's code search to find instances of TJ actions changed files in your workflow definition files. Once you've identified where it's being used, you need to halt and replace the malicious action in all of your workflows.
Okay.
And make sure to check, even old branches and tags that might still be active.
Got it.
Critically, you need to audit your workflow logs.
Mm-hmm.
Particularly those from around March 14th and 15th, 2025,
for
any suspicious activity.
Right.
So you want to look for things like references to the URL gist, .githabbustercontent.com.
Got it.
And any unexpected base 64 encoded output in your logs.
Okay, and if you suspect anything.
Yeah, if you suspect anything at all, rotate those secrets immediately.
Wow.
And you want to review your access logs for any unauthorized activity.
Okay, so a comprehensive audit,
Yep.
swift action to replace the component,
Yeah.
and really carefully looking at your logs.
That's right.
Okay, well, this has been, a really informative but, obviously concerning
Yeah,
deep dive into this TJ Actions compromise.
it has.
So to conclude, what are the really critical lessons that we should take away?
Okay, well, the main lessons are pretty clear. The software supply chain, and that includes our CICD pipelines, is really fragile.
Yeah.
And it's an increasingly attractive target for attackers.
Right.
Compromised components within these pipelines, like this GitHub action, have the potential to do a lot of damage.
Right.
They can expose sensitive secrets and they can really undermine the integrity of our software development process.
Absolutely.
So, putting proactive and robust security measures in place, it's not just advisable, it's essential
It is.
in today's threat landscape.
Yeah. Okay. So what are the key actionable steps
Okay.
that you would urge our listeners to take?
The first thing is, go audit your own repositories.
Okay.
Figure out if you're using or if you've used TJ Actions change files.
Right.
And then look at your CI logs for any indicators of compromise around those dates that we talked about.
Right.
If you see anything suspicious, rotate your secrets immediately.
Immediately.
And moving forward, really consider putting those best practices that we talked about into place.
Right.
Pinning your GitHub Actions to commit SHAs for greater immutability.
Yeah.
And enabling that allow listing feature in your GitHub organization to really restrict which actions are allowed to run.
Yeah. Okay, so this incident should really